Right, everyone. This is Marie, and it is 4:02 on Tuesday, January 19, 2021. And I'd like to call to order the work session followed by the agenda review for the 126 board meeting. And before we move into the meat of the meeting, I'd like us to do roll call of board members for the record. So I understand Ms. Munoz will not be with us today, and I am going to move right to Mrs. McGrath. Present?
Yes, I'm present. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. Dr. Narini?
I'm here.
Great. Ms. Smith?
Present.
You, Dr. Thor?
Present.
I'm present. Thank you.
Sure. And Ms. Bittersmith? I don't see her on quite yet, though I know she intends to join us. So with my present, currently we have 6 board members present. Dr. Gonzalez is present, and we're going to move into the context of the meeting. But before we do, and I turn it over to you, Dr. Gonzalez, one with a song for us to kind of kick us off into this meeting today.
Yes, President Sullivan, members of the governing board, CEC, and guests, I've been assigned to come up with a song today. So here's my best attempt at that. Change is inevitable, and it just seems like we've been experiencing so much of it lately, and we're about to experience change in our country. And so with change, I think about John Mayer's song, Waiting on the World to Change. It was written in 2006. As I listened to that, it made me really think about my responsibility in that change. And so then I thought about a song by Michael Jackson called Man in the Mirror, 1988. And it's essentially a similar message, but it says that to begin with the change and move in the right direction, we've got to start with the man in the mirror. So I'm starting with myself. And of course, that I guess today I would probably change that with the person in the mirror, but since he was singing about himself, he used the pronoun man for the noun man. So there you go. I gave you 2 thoughts. How's that?
You did. We're always great. Well, thank you for that. We'll be humming these songs as we go through this. And we're here today in our work session to discuss Maricopa County Community College governance. That would be policies and regulations. So again, back to you, Dr. Gonzalez, to introduce us to our presenters today and our work session. So back to you.
Thank you, President Sullivan, members of the governing board, CEC, and guests. We continue our training, as you said, and today we will be spending some time on Maricopa governance, policies, and regulations. And Ms. Teresa Tony will be delivering a large portion, if not all, of this presentation to you. So I now turn it over to Teresa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan, members of the board, and Dr. Gonzalez. I definitely appreciate the opportunity to discuss this topic. I will be joined by Judy Gregg, who serves as Program Manager Senior in the Office of Public Stewardship. I serve as the director for the Office of Public Stewardship, and one of those functions is to oversee the process for the adoption of the Chancellor's administrative regulations, but I will say that I serve as the unofficial historian for the governing board on its own policies, rules, and regulations, as I've been working with Maricopa boards since 1997. Next slide, please. So this evening, we are going to review 4 primary topics, and I'm coming from the standpoint of the Maricopa Community College District serving as a political subdivision of the state of Arizona, in the context of who we are, not solely as an educational institution, but also as a quasi-government entity that has the ability to assess taxes, issue bonds, adopt its own policies, rules, and regulations. And so with that, we'll be reviewing in part some statutory duties that are pertinent to the governing of the board's authority. We'll look specifically at the Maricopa governance model, which is a modification and an adaptation of the John Carver policy governance model. We'll review the process for adopting policies and regulations, and finally, some recommended next steps that we as staff have recognized and would like to share with both the board and the chancellor. Next slide, please. So this is in part some of the statutes that I use on a day-to-day basis in giving guidance to the Maricopa institution related to board authority versus chancellor authority. And for the members of the board, this is just a small sampling of statutes that we refer to. In total, ARS 15, which resides in the education statutes, chapter 12, we refer to those on a daily basis. Also germane to the governing board's authority is Title 38, Chapter 3, which looks at the duties of public officers. So when we're talking about open meeting law and executive session, we look to Title 38, Chapter 3 for guidance on that. But essentially, ARS 15-1444 and ARS 15-1445 outlines powers and duties of the board in their capacity as policymakers. And some of the specific duties is the authority of the governing to award degrees and certificates and curricula. It's the authority of the governing board to determine the salaries of persons it appoints and employs. It's the duty of the governing board to fix tuition and graduate fees for the system. Next slide, please. Just a bit of history. This year will mark the 25th year since our governing board adopted the policy governance model. And essentially what that means when we're talking about policy governance is that our board has recognized that there is a separation of duty in their role as elected officials versus the role of their CEO or chancellor. So the model was originally adopted back in 1996. And at that point in time, we did have a governing board member who expressed concern as to whether or not the board delegating specific duties to the chancellor, whether or not there was a conflict in terms of the board's statutory authority. Did the board have the authority to delegate to the chancellor certain administrative duties? And what took place is that the general counsel at that point in time wrote a legal opinion looking at the factors of the governance model and assuring that the governing board would retain its statutory duties. And that opinion was submitted to the Attorney General's office for review. The Attorney General declined to review our attorney's review, essentially saying that the matters that were being presented to the Arizona Attorney General were policy decisions, not legal issues. So in essence, that allowed the Maricopa Community College District to go forward and administer the policy governance model. So think about it this way. Prior to 1996, every policy, every rule, every regulation was submitted to the governing board for adoption. In 1996, what took place was that there was a major review of all doctrines, and there was a decision that said, okay, this lane, these are the types of things that our board will adopt, And here are the types of things that we are delegating to our chancellor, to our CEO, to have authority to adopt for the day-to-day administration of the district. Back in 1999, we also had a board member that didn't like the way that the policy governance language was written. It's written in the negative, the chancellor shall not, the chancellor shall not. And so what we did was customize the language to fit the culture of our organization, and we began to refer to it as Maricopa governance. So when we talk about our governance model now, we talk about the Maricopa governance model. In 2011, we brought a policy consultant in to review the structure of our regulations and our board policies. And at that point in time, the consultant made a recommendation that there was a lot of language that the board should really delegate to the chancellor. However, in the review of statutory language, we determined that the governing board should still have ultimate authority over that section of language. So essentially what we did is we created a section called Board Resource Policies, and Judy Gregg and I will review those a little later. And even though they are administrative and operational in nature, they still require governing board authority. And an example of that is our policy on use of force and to have an armed police force. That language resides on the chancellor side of the house, but if we ever make any adoptions to that language or recommendations to amend, that would require governing board approval. Next slide, please. When we talk about Maricopa governance, essentially what we are saying is we're talking about the leadership of our organization. So we have leadership in the form of an elected body of officials, and we have a CEO. And our CEO in our institution is our chancellor. Our chancellor then has an executive council, and both have policy-making roles. We call what the board adopts as policy, and we call what the chancellor adopts as administrative regulations. All of this is done for the purpose of stewardship and public accountability. And in addition to our own internal doctrines, as mentioned before, we routinely to state statutory language, federal rules and regulations, and also accreditation criteria to help shape the doctrines that we follow within our organization. Next slide, please. There are three major types of doctrines that the governing board is responsible for. If we were to look at them or count them up individually, I would say they add up to about 60 areas of items that require governing board approval. One section that we'll talk about today are the specific board policies. We'll lightly touch upon employee staff manuals, and then finally section 6 of the admin regs. On this slide, if you think about what the governing board is responsible for in terms of policy governance, and we did provide the governing board with a visual of a pie chart, there are 4 major categories. We have the governing board outcomes, we have the chancellor limitations and interpretations, the third category is board staff relations, and then finally the governance process. Next slide, please. So here's the visual, and this might look familiar to what Dr. Phelan shared in his presentation. There, imagine a pie chart cut in half, there are two sides. On the right side of that pie chart, those are the areas where the governing board has identified the area for its CEO. So the area in blue are the areas of delegation to the CEO. By contrast, the area on the left side in green, those sections are the policies that specifically outline how the governing board as an elected body will manage its own operations. So category 1, quadrant 1 are the board outcomes. Quadrant 2, the chancellor limitations and interpretations. Quadrant 3, board staff relations. And quadrant 4, governance process. Next slide, please. In quadrant 1, board outcomes, these are the policies that determine the benefits that will occur for the constituents. And as these are identified, they should be prioritized and reflected in the budget. Every year, we have an annual review of the board outcomes. The organizational ends or means. What are we here to do? Who are we here to serve? Previous governing board members have defined the constituents of the community college system as our taxpayers, students, K through 12 schools, because that's where our student population feeds into from, universities, because we prepare our students to go forward to universities if that's their desire, and also public-private partners, particularly in those areas of workforce development and occupational education. Next slide, please. Quadrant 2, this is a very key quadrant for the governing board as it relates to the monitoring of your CEO. This is the quadrant where the governing board says, okay, here are the areas that we are delegating to you. So here are the policies that provide the prudent and ethical boundaries of acceptable chancellor acts. So we have chancellor limitations that cover the expectation that we have for how our students will be treated, how faculty and staff will be treated, interactions with the public and other constituents, the financial condition and assets of the organization, our budgeting, communication and counsel to the board. The board has an expectation of its chancellor that the chancellor will alert the board if there are events happening within the organization that would compromise our stewardship and our integrity and accountability. And finally, operational succession planning. We should always be prepared for someone to take the lead in our organization if something were to happen to our CEO. And finally, public safety. Next slide, please. In addition to the chancellor's limitations, where the governing board establishes boundaries, the chancellor responds back to the board and says, okay, I understand that you have an expectation of me on the treatment of students and the treatment of employees and staff. Here's my interpretation of what that means. You know, for instance, for the treatment of employees, I interpret that to mean that we'll have a non-discrimination policy and we will not discriminate on persons on the basis of these factors. And so with each limitation, the chancellor then answers the board in terms of the expectation of what that policy means. The governing board then either accepts the chancellor's interpretation or there would need to be dialogue for the governing board to say to the chancellor, I don't understand what you mean, or can you work on it this way instead? So there was a time when we would have very vibrant conversations between the governing board and the chancellor, work sessions, strategic conversations, where there was an ongoing dialogue between the chancellor and the board to make sure that this was happening on a routine basis and very fluidly. Because with your chancellor, you don't want to wait till the end of an evaluation cycle and say, oh, you didn't meet all of this. The evaluation of your chancellor should be ongoing. So the interpretation should be clear, explicit, they should be measurable. How do we measure whether or not those expectations are being met? Next slide, please. Quadrant 3, and now we're getting into that left side of the pie chart, the green shaded areas. This is where the board, as an elected body, you have policies that outline how you will operate as a collective unit. So quadrant 3 are the policies that determine and describe your relationship and accountability through the chancellor. It talks about your unity of control, the kind of delegation that you provide, the expectations of the monitoring. The governing board also has a relationship in policy with other functional areas such as the internal audit department, as well as your general counsel. Quadrant 4, please. Okay. So the final quadrant, your governance process, it is how you plan as a board to connect with others. Your governing values, your manner of governing, your job description, the planning of your agenda, the role of your board chair or board president, how you will link with the community, and the principles, your board member code of conduct. This is one that comes up often. When it comes to board member code of conduct, the entity that oversees that is the board as a body. The awarding of emeritus status, and also your governance investment. This session right now and the ones that you've had over the previous weeks are examples of the commitment to the governing board investing in its own development. And Mrs. Sullivan, I might take a pause there to see if anyone has any questions over what I've gone through so far.
That works. Board members, I can quickly run down your names. And if you do, then speak up. And I notice, Ms. Bittersmith, you're now with us. So I'll start with you. Do you have any key question? And we won't get into a lot of dialogue right now, but any key question on these items right now? Yes, hi.
Can you hear me okay without it now? You're still getting the echo. Thought we had this fixed. I'll quickly eliminate the echo. Which is
I don't hear much of an echo, so please go ahead.
Oh, okay. If you don't, that's good. So here's my question. I want to better understand. I heard earlier in the presentation that there was some flexibility in the governing board's responsibilities and how they supervise the executive role from the chancellor and others. Did I understand that correctly? Because I think that's accurate. That would be a board decision on how engaged they are at upper levels of management. Is that correct?
Mrs. Sullivan, can you repeat the question? I barely heard it.
Yeah, Susan, you started out strong and then we lost you. Well, it started to garble again. So your comment is further explanation on the executive attention to the separation of responsibilities or roles. Is that part of what I heard?
My question is, does the board, can the board expand a bit of its role and how it interacts with the executive management, in other words, the chancellor and the university, the college president?
I can answer that, Mrs. Sullivan.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Under the governance model as adopted by previous board and how we have implemented it. The chancellor serves as the primary and really employee of the governing board when it comes to giving direction. So the protocol would be if the governing board had a question of a college president, that you should always include the chancellor in those conversations. It would not be appropriate for a governing board member to go to a college and to give directions to a college president. If you wanted to visit a college and learn about programs, that's fine, but to give direction, that is the delegation that the board has given to its CEO. Does that answer your question?
Partially. I have not been able to find in any minutes or history any overt action of the board making that decision, and that's my question. Is it just custom and practice, or has there actually been a motion by the board to set this as operating policy? And I'm just asking.
Oh, okay.
Teresa, I believe that she might have missed the very first slide. I don't know if you were present with us, Ms. Bittersmith, when we went over 1996 and 1999. Did you catch that?
I did, but I can't find
Okay.
Okay.
any action by the board. I know there's a report saying it happened, but I'm not seeing any motion.
Okay. I think one thing that I'll be able to do is provide the board through the Chancellor's office with some of the historical documents regarding the decision and the deliberations that the board made at that point in time. But this definitely is the concept of the then policy governance model, which we now call Maricopa governance, is for the board to delegate the day-to-day operations of the college district to its chancellor. And so then when it comes to interaction with staff, that in most instances is through the chancellor's office. But I would give myself as an example. The role that I serve for the governing board is to provide support and archiving your policies, your rules, your regulations, doing research on, prior decisions. So it's not unusual for a governing board member to contact me directly because that's the function of the role that I serve. Now that would be different than me wanting to go to, college A and tell the college president, I don't doing here, you need to do it better. That is expressly the role of the chancellor.
And I understand the balancing act here, please. What I'm trying to determine though is, even the slide says language tone, but couldn't find in any history, any minutes where there was an overt action of the board. And I've read through the AG's opinion, just trying to get a sense, because I know it changed, and I'm trying to, if the board had any interest, and believe me, I'm not advocating the board wants to micromanage anyone, but if there's a conversation that the board might have about their role with and through in cooperation with the chancellor on potentially interacting with the college president, I think we could do that legally under the statute if we overtly chose to do that, correct?
I really think that this topic lends itself perhaps to work session where when we hopefully will reassemble the board policy subcommittees. A conversation about authority is actually one of the recommendations that I would be making at the end of this presentation. So where that line or that swim lane rests is really a conversation between the board and the chancellor to determine how thick and how wide and how long those lines are.
That makes sense to me. I don't disagree at all. I think that's a great plan.
Mrs. Sullivan?
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Gonzalez. I was going to move on. Go ahead.
It sounds through Teresa's response that Mrs. Bittersmith has some really good questions. Unfortunately, I can't hear her nearly at all, and I'm getting text messages from others that they cannot hear her as well. So I'm not sure if it's something that's on our end or if there's a technological issue on the other end, but we would really love to hear her questions.
Well, I'm going to move us on. Essentially, we will be having this conversation around roles and responsibilities, authority, and where this came from, when it was decided, the historical framework for this. And then as we go through policies, this would certainly be a work session that we will have to talk about it further. So apologies to everyone about the technology, and apologies to you, Ms. Bittersmith, as well, for me trying to recapture the essence of what you're saying, and perhaps I haven't done as good a job, but we will move forward with that in another discussion. Okay. And I will come back at the end to talk about our steps moving forward after your presentation, Ms. Tony, on next steps about where we believe the board is headed on this. So with that, I'm going to move on. I know we spent a lot of time there. Just then, does any one other board member have a pressing question, or can we wait until further down the line on this? If you do and you feel it's pressing, please speak up. Someone's trying. Is there someone else who has a pressing question at this point? Okay, I don't have indications then. And moving forward, and Ms. Bittersmith, I'm not quite sure how we can tackle this sound issue for you in the next go round here. But with that, Ms. Tony, please continue.
Okay, thanks. Elza, next slide, please. And as that slide is coming up, that actually is a good segue for the conversation that we were having. And so, for the good of the order, for those who may not have been able to hear, the question related to Chancellor board authority, particularly at the local level, and what types of things would be appropriate for.
Excuse me, Ms. Tony, I hate to interrupt you. There's a lot, somebody calling. We can hear a phone dialing and other noises. So please check your mute and so we can move forward. Silence. Okay, go for it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So again, on the issue of authority, determining what falls in the board's swim lane versus the chancellor's swim lane is definitely a conversation that we constantly seek to have. And the two items on the screen right now are reflective of prior conversations. So areas where we have deliberated and determined that this is something that should continue to reside with the governing board is the adoption of employee policy manuals. Employee policy manuals serve as the doctrines that outline the employment conditions, rights, and responsibilities for our employees. My office does not facilitate that process. It's actually overseen by human resources. But I'm lifting it up tonight for the board to be aware that there is a pillar that requires their approval, and that is for the employee policy manuals. Board resource policies, the column on the right, that represents Section 6 that I referred to earlier. These are definitely areas that are day-to-day operational policies that could quite easily, perhaps in some systems, reside fully under the chancellor, but because of review of the board's statutory authority, whenever there is a need to amend or adopt one of these sections, we go before the governing board. And so the next slide will give you an indication of those types of areas. So the board resource policies, and there are 24 of them. These are areas where the governing board either retains authority statutorily, or the manner in which they were adopted was a mandate. Some of you may be familiar, many years ago, about 12 or so years ago, the district was under a lot of public scrutiny over matters related to travel and expenditures. It was at that point in time that the governing board mandated that certain things would happen within our institution. So we were mandated to have a public stewardship and ethics course that all employees would go through. And so the Section 6 of the governing board policies is reserved for administrative areas that the governing board has not delegated to the chancellor. And it is also reflected of areas where the governing board retains statutory authority or has elected to mandate conditions within our organization. Okay. Next slide, please. So because you are a publicly elected body, and when we are at the point of making a policy change or adopting a new policy, the steps are outlined here just generally. It's in section 4.5 of your board meetings rules of action policy title. An item would be submitted to the governing board first as an information item, and then secondly as an agenda item. So if it's a policy item, it goes before the board 2 times. First is information to notify the public and any other constituents that there is an intent to change or adopt policy. And then finally for action. Now in between there may be a direction of the board that items may need more research. But the key point there is that before adopting a formal policy, it must go before the governing board at least twice. Once the language is adopted, my office assists in posting it online for public access. So unless there are any additional questions on what I've said thus far, I'd like to turn it over to Judy Gregg, who works in my office. She serves as Program Analyst Senior, and Judy helps to facilitate the process for the adoption of those doctrines that have been delegated to the chancellor. So we have 2 processes at least, one for items that go before the board, and then items that go before the chancellor for adoption. So Judy, are you on the line there? I know that she was joining by phone.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you, Teresa, for the introduction. President Sullivan, members of the board, Dr. Gonzalez, and members of CEC and guests. As Teresa mentioned, next slide, please. Thank you. As Teresa mentioned, upon the governance leadership model adoption in 1996, the governing board transferred certain policies to the chancellor, and these are called administrative regulations, and they cover the areas that you see here on the slide. Teresa just spoke to us about Section 6, which is the board resource policies, but apart from those, these are all administrative regulations that are approved by the chancellor. They're used by the chancellor in managing the day-to-day operations of the district, and they're amended, adopted, or deleted as necessary, and they're subject to a formal review process. Next slide, please. The administrative regs serve as our what we call the doctrine of reference with regards to Maricopa's operations, and they are maintained by the Office of Public Stewardship in consultation with the Chancellor, and they receive legal review prior to adoption. Most administrative regs are developed utilizing a process that includes stakeholder input in the development process and then comment and feedback during the review process. This is done so that doctrines are understood prior to their adoption, and it also reflects our shared governance model. You can see the different stages here, and you can see the process here. They're outlined on this slide as well as on the Maricopa Governance webpage. Next slide, please. Thank you. The catalog common pages are a compiled list of board policies, administrative regulations, appendix items, and program information that specifically relates to students. And the catalog common pages are reviewed and updated annually by the Catalog Common Pages Committee. The committee is made up of subject matter experts and functional council representatives, and this process parallels the administrative regulation process. However, it's a little different in that these proposed changes are coordinated by the Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs, and it also includes stakeholder input in development process and then the comment and feedback during the review process. This year, the Maricopa Student Senate was added to the stakeholder input gathering process, and they reflect specifically the point of view of students. Some examples of some of the issues that have recently been addressed by the catalog common pages include Administrative Regulation 2.3.3, which deals with grading, Administrative Regulation 2.4, which deals with transfer credit, and also dealing with prior learning assessment credit. So I'll turn it over to Teresa at this time, unless there are questions for me.
I think we'll move forward and then I'll go through all the board members at one time.
Okay.
Back to you, Teresa.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Ms. Then we just have 2 slides left. So next slide, please. A key component for Maricopa governance is conducting evaluations in at least 3 areas. 1, for the board to evaluate itself as policymakers. How are you doing? How are you working together? Are you meeting your goals? And I know that there has been some discussion about various tools that may be used for the board to be able to do that. But it's important that the board engage in routine review of its operations. The second area is for the board to evaluate its outcomes. And recall again the pie chart, the quadrant number 1. The outcomes are the deliverables or the intended ends for the people who we serve. So how well are we doing as an institution as it relates to serving our students? So it's important for the board to conduct an annual review of the outcome for its stakeholders. And finally, the evaluation of the Chancellor. And I've already mentioned that that should also be routine. Even though the evaluation may be scheduled to take place in May, every quarter, at least there should be some review of how things are going so that there can be an ongoing dialogue and the opportunity to correct any issues that may serve as policies not being in compliance. And finally, the last slide. Just my observations, I mentioned before, I think I serve as the board's unofficial historian, and having worked with the board since 1997, recommendations that I would like to make would be, of course, and this has already been talked about, that the board establish its policy subcommittee, reenact that activity, and that we establish a new schedule for reviewing all of the board's policies, because we've had, a lot of changes in our organization. So let's start fresh and have a new conversation about existing policies and if there are any gaps. Item number 2, review those matters as brought before about board versus chancellor authority. Every day, office receives questions as to whether or not an area requires board approval or does it require chancellor approval. So there's always a constant review to make sure that the items being presented or proposed are going through the proper authority. Item number 3, I understand that the governing board is utilizing the new policy or document management platform called Board Docs, that's where action items will be submitted. So a determination will need to be made as to whether or not the policy content should also reside on that. I've had some initial conversations with IT and others to identify the implications of that, but that's also a conversation that I would like to have further with Dr. Gonzalez and the board. And then finally, identify monitoring tools and frequency for evaluation, not only for the governing board, but also for the chancellor. It's very important that we get back to monitoring our leadership activities. And with that, Mrs. Sullivan, I'd like to turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tony and Ms. Gregg, for the presentation today. I know that it raises some questions, also provides a lot of clarity in this context of policy governance. A couple of things before I move into the Q&A. We definitely, per our bylaws and our policies, will be reestablishing the board. Well, we'll be identifying the policy subcommittee as a critical committee. And with that, Ms. Jacqueline Smith, and with my support, will be working primarily on that subcommittee to bring us to that we need to attend to this year. So I wanted to say that we appreciate the recommendation that we go ahead and continue that committee, and will in fact be doing so. As you know, last year we were fully intentional to review our policies and take on the conversations that they present, and then we were waylaid by other activities and primarily COVID and all sorts of things. So it is our intention to continue to move forward this year and address those issues that you raised. So with that, I am going to go through the board to ask if they have any individual questions. And Ms. Bittersmith, if you would like, if you have another key question at some point, if you would like to text it to me, I'll be glad to read it out loud if there's any concern about communicating with the current technology challenges. But with that, I'm going to move and go the other direction. And with that, let me start with you, Ms. Smith. Let's just do that. Do you have any key questions at this point?
Thank you for asking. No, for the sake of time, I will reserve questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. McGrath. I know she's still on mute. There you go. Okay. Mrs. McGrath, you have a key question?
No, I did not, and I've been off mute quite the whole time.
Oh, okay. Well, no questions, and I know you'll look forward to our next work sessions on this. Dr. Narini.
No questions at this time. Just like as we move forward, I would appreciate some more clarification on the board self-evaluation, and what that means and how do we go about it, and what tools do we use, and then just also for future, just kind of some more clarification on the authority that the Section 6 areas and which areas that we've retained authority on. Just some of the specifics on some of those. But yeah, I think that's more for later instead of at this point.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Thor.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. I think this was an excellent presentation, very clear, and I would concur with the recommendations that Teresa Tony is making. And it feels really good to me for the board to be, again, returning its attention to its policies and the associated practices. So this is very welcome to me. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good. Ms. Nguyen.
I would echo what Dr. Thor said in terms of the presentation and the statutory explanation of our role and responsibilities. This again is a lot of information, and there, I hope there's a way we can refer back to some of the things that were presented. I also look at a lot of things that happened seem to happen in reaction to the travel thing. We then, and I remember when something happens, we need to correct. It would be nice if we could be proactive. Some of the things that the board want to retreat or had some retreat facilitation. I think if that would be useful, or history that was presented to show we got to where we got, and I appreciate the time and attention that was given to this. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you. And one thing and Ms. Bittersmith, I know you're still trying to work on fixing the audio, and your comment, and I'll share, it was that she thinks as we move forward with the policy committee being re-established with an actual work agenda this year, without, we hope, any option or challenge like we encountered last year, that we'll be able to answer questions through either further work sessions or other work activity. I will say that a board retreat is top of mind, where we can tackle in a new way some of these conversations. We still have the option of work sessions, and we'll be evaluating how and when to do those. But certainly our own professional development is critical as we move through these discussions and concentrate on policy governance, and specifically the policies that are governing our district. We need time to review those, evaluate those, discuss them, and next steps. And that is certainly a primary agenda item for this year. In terms of tools, yes, those are also big items for further discussion, evaluation, both of the board and the chancellor, top of mind. Absolutely support and agree with that. And the other piece, it came up in our presentation with Dr. Phelan, and that was the idea of mission, vision, et cetera. 16 years since those things have been discussed. So hopefully they will be part of our activity this year, also tied to the policy elements. So we're setting the stages for this month, of course, for a lot of the work that we have ahead of us this year. And I am enthusiastic that we as a board have an interest to keep pursuing this conversation and get this work done this year, and probably as it overlaps into next. So I think this is a good thing. And again, Ms. Tony, Ms. Gregg, very much appreciate the presentation, its representation of history, as well as including us into how we need to move forward. So thank you. Well done. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marie.
Yeah. Oh, wait a minute.
Marie.
Ms. Bittersmith, go ahead.
This is
Yes.
really just a test to see if you can hear me and we don't have echoes. And it sounds like Jordan, who is a miracle worker, may have fixed that for me. So I just wanted to make sure it's working, and you correctly characterized my comments. I think the establishment of the policy committee in that conversation will respond to my questions. So I apologize for all of the echoing problems earlier. I think we have it fixed.
Yay. That's it. I think all of us.
That's historic.
Yes.
We spent 3 weeks dealing with this.
All right. So with that, we are now to go into agenda review directly. And so I'm going to ask all of you who are choosing to participate in that agenda review session, please stay on the line. And I don't think I'm going to give us a pause. I think I'm going to go straight ahead, because as I look at the agenda, certainly most of it is consent agenda items for discussion tonight under agenda review. And then I will talk about some things that are for upcoming. So with that, we'll move to the agenda review. And prior to our regularly scheduled meeting on January 26th, we are scheduled for another work session, this time based on the budgeting calendar, whatever we want to frame that. So what will happen beginning at 5 p.m. on 1/26 next week is we will have a work session on fiscal year 21-22 budget development. We will have updates on revenues and expenditures by fund. And as soon as that presentation is available, it will be sent to us. But that is on the agenda for next week prior to convening the regular meeting. So with that, then under agenda review, we would move, of course, into our traditional aspects of hearing different reports. And that would also include the Chancellor's report. We would move into citizens interim for any input from our citizens, and then we will move right into the consent agenda. So items for discussion or comment, I will, today on that, I will read the title and ask for any comment or questions. And the first item for consideration on the consent agenda is the approval of the 2021 legislative agenda, which was in our materials to review. So are there any comments or questions pending on our legislative agenda approval under consent?
Ms. Sullivan?
Mrs. Sullivan?
Yes. Okay. So I hear Dr. Thor and Ms. Nguyen, correct?
Actually, it's Ms. Bittersmith, but.
Oh, sorry, I apologize. Okay. I'm going to go with let's do, okay. You know, this sometimes it's cumbersome. I apologize. All right. Dr. Thor, you go first, and then Ms. Bittersmith.
Thank you. On item number, they're consecutively numbered. Item number 7, at the work session on the legislative agenda, I requested, and I thought it was accepted, a revision of that item. And my proposal was that it say support access to quality, affordable baccalaureate degrees, including limited authority for community colleges to offer baccalaureate degrees in areas of workforce development. So I was surprised and frankly a little frustrated to see that that was not reflected.
Okay, Ms. Renfro, are you with us to offer comment and how you will accommodate?
President Sullivan, Dr. Thor, I apologize. I thought all the changes discussed were incorporated into this new item, and so we can make that change and it will be reflected in the final board item that will be voted on next week.
So does that mean that there were other changes that are not reflected in this document as well?
No, I thought all the changes that were discussed were reflected, and I'm not sure why that one didn't make it, but I believe all the changes, I believed all the changes had been reflected in this current document. But we will go through all the notes and make sure that each of these items this is the accurate version. Stranger things have happened, and it will ensure that those are all updated. But I believe this was just an oversight on number 7 in terms of the change that you requested.
Very good. Thank you.
Ms. Renfro, can you highlight what other changes made, or do you have a document in front of you that you say we asked for X change and it changed into Y, only because some of us have memory challenges like I do?
Yeah, I don't have that in President Sullivan. I don't have that in front of me. There weren't as many changes. I'm going to ask if Alexis Sustoff, our Government Relations Director, if she has a document of that nature and could go back through and explain any of the additional changes that were made.
Do that, and then to you, Ms. Bittersmith. But Alexis, do you have that update?
Yes. Can you guys hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Mrs. Sullivan, members of the board, Chancellor, and invited guests. That was the only major change, and I will say that was completely my oversight. I copy and pasted the wrong version. So I do have Dr. Thor's comments, and I will make sure that is worked in.
Thank you. Ms. Bittersmith.
Just a general comment, and I recall this conversation before I was a board member, so I listened to the earlier presentation before the end of the year. Obviously, the session has already started, and I recognize we're in an unusual year, and we've had staff changes, et cetera. But I spent the afternoon testifying virtually with no echo, I want you to know, on bills this afternoon, and they're moving very rapidly through the process. So I'm hopeful as we move onward into next sessions, we should be looking at this in October or even November at the latest in the effort to do any pre-filed bills or be working on these issues that have been pre-filed, because unfortunately, we're a little bit late to the game this session to even talk about these issues because things are already in place. So it's just a generic comment, and again, I understand all of the unique challenges, so it's not intended to be a criticism, just an opportunity to maybe be a little more proactive for next session.
Thank you. Ms. Renfro, do you have a comment?
President Sullivan, Ms. Bittersmith, yes, you are absolutely correct in that we would prefer to have this be done earlier, but I will say this is a marked improvement from past practice where we had not either had a legislative agenda at all or presented one in February or March. I think I think you explained it accurately in that given the changes in the board makeup, we did the work session in November, but understood that there may be other opinions about the direction that we wanted to take. And so this was the first opportunity we were able to get this agenda to the board for a formal vote. We intend fully to address the timeline in future years. Absolutely.
Great. Again, it wasn't meant to be critical, just trying to get us to be more proactive. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Any other? Yes.
So this is Mrs. Nguyen.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I believe that there's been a slight extension, though, to when bills can be dropped to February 7th. I can stand corrected on that, and that they may give us a little bit more time. So I realize we're up against a deadline, but maybe there'll be some wiggle room for us.
And just Ms. Silva, there is a pre-file opportunity, obviously, which has passed. You can drop bills between now and then. That given the nature of the session, you're much more successful. I know Mrs. Nguyen knows this. If you do it sooner rather than later, so I'm just thinking for next session we can. And it sounds like our team is exactly on that mission. So
great, thank you.
Thank you. Any other comment on this agenda item?
I have a quick one. This is Dr. Narini.
Yes, go ahead.
Just on number 8, protect and expand local district authority and control in the administration of the colleges. Is there some threat that our control is being limited?
President Sullivan, Dr. Narini, there has been, in at least the last 3 legislative sessions, some measure that has been introduced that tries to dictate what either kinds of courses we should offer or sort of chips away at some of those, the administration, this board's authority over the community colleges by dictating different things. So this is really, at this point in the session, this is prophylactic in that we anticipate should something like that occur, we will have direction from this board to weigh in. But I can think of a couple different examples where we've been, legislation's been introduced by sometimes outside state interests to dictate to us and or the universities how to do a particular thing.
Oh, thank you. And then on the next one, on 9, that support the efforts to expand opportunities for high school students, I'm guessing that ACE is going to be included and Hoopa Learning are going to be included in some of those opportunities?
President Sullivan, Dr. Narini, at this point, yes, there are several ideas floating out in the legislature currently to help support community college students in different ways. There are at least 3 sponsors looking at building a state-supported system for community college students, which currently doesn't exist at all. And so with that in mind, we are absolutely also talking to legislators about the disproportionate impact that COVID has had on these students that you're speaking about and the students that enter these programs that need additional supports. So should something move forward with dual enrollment in particular, they would necessarily include students who are enrolled in those programs.
Thank you. And has there been any talk about incorporating the CLEP test? Because I know there's a lot of talk about AP and expanding the role of AP in the high schools so that students can earn college credits. But the CLEP program and the CLEP tests are another opportunity for students to earn college credits while they're in high school. I don't know where that is on the agenda of anybody, or if it's even on one of the things being considered.
Dr. Narini, President Sullivan, I have not heard about that. We have at various times heard and spoken to members and the governor's office about incentives for dual enrollment that exist for things like AP, but the CLEP test has not been brought up. If Alexis, Ms. Susdorf may have other information, but I have not seen any legislation to that effect, and nor have I heard of anyone who's focused on that issue at this time.
Okay, yeah, because I just know that from our school, our Spanish students will take the CLEP test, and for the last, I don't know, 8-10 years, they've all received at least 8 credits and some as much as 12 to 16 college credits for their Spanish just by taking the test. And I know that's a lot more credits than they can receive by taking the AP or passing the AP exam. So I think it's, especially for some of our students, it would be a great benefit. So
okay. Absolutely. Let us look into that.
That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else have questions on this item?
This is Jacqueline. I have a question, and I'm just procedurally trying to understand the best way to do this. So I have a question about policy number 7, in addition to Dr. Thor's edit. And I'm not sure if procedurally I can pose the question now, or if the appropriate step is to request that this agenda item be removed from the consent agenda to invite future discussion in the future.
You're welcome under our agenda review as we take on each topic to ask your question of staff or others for clarification that will reinforce our action on the regular board meeting, either to have it pulled or to keep it with the consent. So if you have a question forming right now, please ask it.
Okay. I recall in some of the conversations that I've been prior to being officially on the board, so the conversations that I have observed on this topic, that there are particular bachelor degrees that are applied, and that there are specific programs that have been identified. So should this policy position move forward and the legislature affirms that the community colleges can move forward with these degrees, that there again would be specific degree programs. And so I'm wondering, is there a reason why this statement is fairly broad and we are not specifying either the applied nature of the degrees or the degree programs themselves?
President Sullivan and Ms. Smith, I'll answer the question maybe a little bit indirectly. Aside from having the wrong language in this board item, which it should not have happened, we have been working since last session with ABOR and the universities to come to some sort of agreement around guardrails. And the guardrails are not specifically highlighting degree programs or program areas, but what we have agreed with ABOR on is that the community college boards who ultimately approve the curriculum and approve the programs would need to make those decisions based on a clear workforce need, financial administrative analysis, feasibility, and some reference to duplication of effort. There's also within that some recognition in the legislative intent that we are not, our intent is not to become a Research One institution. Our intent is not to become another university. Our intent is to respond to the needs of the workforce in degree program areas that now once perhaps required only an associate degree and now require a bachelor's degree. So respiratory therapy is an example we use, nursing is an example we use as well. So the other guardrails that we have discussed with ABOR is that only 10% initially for Maricopa and Pima should Pima and Maricopa choose to engage in four-year degrees, and this is an option. The current legislation that was introduced by the same author last year, Representative Nutt, is to limit the number of degree programs that a community college could establish baccalaureate degree programs to 10% of the total offerings for the first several years, and then that would go up to 15%. So we could never offer more four-year degrees, more than 10% of our total number of degrees that would be four-year degrees. That restriction does not apply to smaller community college districts. The bill sponsor is from Eastern Arizona College area in Safford, and it did not want a similar restriction placed on the rural colleges who are desperate for access to four-year degrees. And finally, the other guardrail that we have agreed or been talking to ABOR about is that 150% of, we could only charge on up to 150% of current tuition for those upper division courses, for the 300 and 400 level courses, so that one of the major drivers for some legislators is the possibility of a four-year degree that costs somewhere around $10,000. And they like that notion, and our students have liked the notion of being able to access a degree for that cost in those very needed high demand workforce areas. And we were agreeing to limit what we could charge for those. So those are the guardrails that are currently in discussion, and we believe that ABOR and the universities have moved to a neutral position on this with those guardrails in place.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is Jacqueline. I just have one further question. Apologies if it's been answered in a previous meeting. If the best case scenario occurred for this legislative cycle, when do you anticipate the bachelor's programs would first be able to launch in a best case scenario?
In a best case scenario, that might be a better question, Ms. Smith, to the provost or chancellor or one of the colleges. We would have an effective date. We're not asking for an emergency effective date, so it would be an effective date sometime in the summer, with all other legislation that is signed by the governor. So I think it would take a good year or two to get programs up. Again, there are some very specific, like respiratory therapy, that there's been interest in beginning that, and there is currently no other program available in Arizona through a public higher ed institution in a baccalaureate degree in respiratory therapy, only at private institutions. We are being, one of the things we're also being asked to agree to in moving forward is to report in to submit an audit report to the Auditor General within 5 years. And we actually, within 5 years, we may or may not be able to have a degree program up and have anybody completed. So I think it is a good 1 to 2 years from the effective date of this legislation that we would be able to offer those. I don't know what the answer would be to some of our sister districts. We have access to a significant number of PhD faculty and those who are qualified to deliver those 300, 400 level courses. And I'm not able to speak to that with regard to the other community colleges.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Any other question on this item before I move on to the next?
Yes, Ms. McGrath here.
Yeah.
I'm very concerned about the cost of this to our taxpayers. I don't think that they should be on the hook for education.
Mrs. McGrath, I think we lost you somehow. I hear you said you're concerned about the cost. Are you referring to specifically item 7 on the agenda? Okay.
Yes. I don't think our taxpayers should have to be on the hook for a 4-year degree. They're already on the hook for a lot of money. They provide at least at a minimum 68% of the cost of education at community colleges, and I don't think that they should have to pay for a 4-year degree. And I was hoping that somehow or another the bill would be written that the state would pick up the extra cost, because if the state wants it, let them pay for it. I don't think our taxpayers should be obligated for that at all.
Ms. Renfro, I'm sure that's been duly noted as we move forward on this.
Yes, it is duly noted. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Mrs. McGrath. Any other questions on this item or comments? So, yes.
Ms. Sullivan, I have one more. I'd like to have a copy of the bill.
Go ahead.
Could we have a copy of the bill sent to us, please?
Mrs. McGrath, President Sullivan, absolutely, we can get the bill. I am not sure the final language has been worked out entirely, the bill sponsor, but as soon as, if it has been introduced and we have clear language, we will send that to you. If not, we'll get that to you as soon as the bill is dropped.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to move us on to remaining items or on each individual item under the consent agenda. So moving on to item 2, transfer from Maricopa Community Colleges Foundation, new grant award, JP Morgan Chase, building capacity, IT and cybersecurity to support virtual job training in a COVID and post-COVID environment. Are there any comments or questions on that item? Being none, I'll move on to 3. Transfer from Maricopa Community Colleges Foundation, new grant award, Bank of America, Mesa Community College Native American Indian Institute Student Support Program. Any comments or questions? Item 4, transfer from Maricopa Community Colleges Foundation, new grant award, Intel Corporation, MCCC Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning Program. Any comments or questions? Item 5, new grant award, National Science Foundation, Gateway Community College STEM Scholars. Are there any comments or questions? Item 6, approval of a 3 renewal of the Pixlet production software agreement. Are there any comments or questions? Item 7, conceptual approval model the tower building 3rd floor at Rio Salado College. Are there any comments or questions? Number 8, job order contracting purchase order for AIT remodel in the T50 building at Mesa Community College, Southern and Dobson campus. Are there any comments or questions? Number 9, job order contracting purchase order for the biology, lab remodel in NU6 building at Mesa Community College, Southern and Dobson campus. Are there any comments or questions? Number 10, job order contracting purchase order for ADA restroom renovations at Glen College. Are there any comments or questions? Item 11, job order contracting order for NU building renovations at Glendale Community College. Are there any comments or questions? Item 12, order and contract to MasterCore Commercial Services for outsourced custodial services at Scottsdale Community College. Are there any comments or questions?
Is that a $5 million contract?
Gonzalez?
President Sullivan, Mrs. Wynn, I would need to defer to either to Dr. Moore or to President Haynes on that, whether that's a correct dollar amount.
President Sullivan, board members, Chancellor Gonzalez, CEC members, this is Jim Moore, the interim Chief Operating Officer. That is an amount for, I believe, a 5-year contract. It's about $1 million a year for the square footage, but I can defer to someone from the college to speak to it in its entirety, or possibly someone in our contracts office that's on the line could also.
I'd like to remove this from the consent agenda. I understand it's $1 million a year, but I don't understand why we're doing a 5-year term on this. Why janitorial services? I mean, a 2-year contract or something, but 5 years into the future with. I'd like to just remove it so I could have more time to look at this. That's a large.
As it stands right now, it can remain on the agenda. We can pull it for next week, unless after review, Dr. Gonzalez determined it's best to take it out. With that, and thank you. And, with that, item 14 is just review of our consent agenda process, and we'll move which we currently operate. As we move through the agenda for next week, it would be first read for the 2021 board calendar, and certainly, or comments on that. And do we have any comments on that? Let me back up, sorry.
Yes, I have a comment on that.
Yes, Mrs. McGrath.
In the past, we held our meetings on the 2nd and 4th Tuesdays of the month. We had 2 weeks to look at the suggestions, the agenda, and I go back to that because 1 week doesn't give enough time to delve into any agenda items you might have a problem with. I'd like to suggest we go back to the prior meeting schedule.
Okay, so is there any other discussion on this as an agenda item for next week? Any other comments? Yay, nay, no.
Ms. Sullivan, this is Linda Thor. It's
Yes.
my recollection that we moved from the second to the third week at the request of the then Chancellor, who indicated that more time was needed to get the agenda together. So we have a different Chancellor now and different people in key roles. So, perhaps they need to discuss it and weigh in as to whether they need that extra week or not.
Thank you for the history on that. Certainly, I do recall a brief conversation about this last year. Also, a tentative calendar has gone out, certainly as it is presented in today's agenda review. And I don't know if people have already assumed that would be where we're going and their calendars have been marked accordingly. But is there any other comment on this as Dr. Gonzalez and his team answer that one particular question, or have over and offer us comment on that? Any other comment, board members? Dr. Gonzalez, I know this is coming at you, and if you need time to think about this.
Thank you.
You have that opportunity. Do you have any comment right now?
President Sullivan, initial comments are that, more time is always appreciated. In fact, we find ourselves even needing time prior to the agenda review in preparation for final presentations that would be given to the board. But we will do what our board asks of us. I appreciate the calendar as it is, but again, we'll do what our board asks of us here.
Okay. So board members, we're here to make a decision today. But if you have any comment and want to weigh in, this will be up for consideration, though it's not listed as an action item quite yet. So it may need to shift if there's an interest to vote on this item. Also under information items, employment and separations, any comments about that? The agenda will then move next time to the monitoring reports of the review of the budget analysis for Report Fund 1 for 5 months ending 11/30 and also for 6 months ending 12/31. Then we would move into governing board reports, and I at that time will make some announcements on board committees. In looking then for the establishment of next meeting, I want to say that one of the things that we need to do, there are two things. One is receive the monitoring report, and it was postponed from the end of last year to early year, and I understand it'll be ready for presentation, and therefore we will be scheduling a work session, on the monitoring report for February 2nd. And that will then be followed by a special board meeting so we can have a first reading of the FACT agreement. The FACT agreement needs 2 readings, and therefore the second reading would be at the regularly scheduled board meeting in February. So please, board members, will start at 4:30 on February 2nd with the monitoring report, to be followed then by a special board meeting for the first reading of the FACT agreement. And then after that, we'll move into, unless changed on the calendar by moving 2021 board calendar to an action item, we can take a comment or vote on dates. We'll move into either a February 16 agenda review at 4, followed by a regularly scheduled meeting on February 23rd. One of the comments certainly that has come up again this year is a full year, and we will continue to have work sessions. My interest is most of them will occur on Tuesdays prior to our meetings or on other Tuesdays to start generally at 4:30. If we need other meetings and we need to move to meeting schedules, those will move to Thursday and those would convene at 5:30. So just be aware as you're looking at your calendars as we move forward, that as we progress in our work together, those would be the times I would identify for putting in extra work meetings. But this is our responsibility. We have a lot of ground to cover this year, and I appreciate everyone's support to get the work done as we move forward. So with that,
Ms. Sullivan?
Yes, Dr. Thor.
Yes. Thor, my apologies. I did have a recommendation on the calendar.
Okay.
Under July, it says there are no meetings in the month of July. It says something like that. I would in the last few years, we have had need for either an executive session or a special meeting of some kind. So I would recommend that it say instead that there's no regular board meeting in the month of July.
Thank you.
So as to allow that ability to have an executive session or a work session should circumstances require it.
Thank you. Good comment. Any other comments with good of the? Yes, Dr. Gonzalez.
I could do, when you're all done, I do have something to say, but I want to make sure that you get through your part of it. I just wanted to get that before you close the meeting out.
Please, go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity, President Sullivan, members of the board. You all received the notification today of our departure of our provost, and I sent an email out to communicate that out to the district. And I want to say thank you to Carla for her time in the Maricopa district and for her leadership. It's been a pleasure working with her. She has accepted a position in another organization, and she will be with us until February 12th. So we still have a few weeks with her, and we'll continue to benefit from her continued leadership here. So I wanted to say that, make that very clear, and to thank her here, because I don't know if we'll get that opportunity at upcoming board meetings. So the word came out today, and again, thank you, Carla. It's been a pleasure working with you, and we look forward to the next few weeks. And it's certainly a bittersweet scenario, in that we're sad to see you go, but we're also happy to support your next professional and personal endeavors. So thank you for the opportunity to say that, President Sullivan.
Absolutely, and support your comments. We will have an opportunity, I believe, to hear from Dr. Fisher at our work session on the monitoring report. So we have an opportunity to hear from her then. Right, Ms. Dr. Fisher?
Yes, you do, and thank you, Chancellor Gonzalez. I will be here until the 12th.
Okay, so we're not saying goodbye yet.
Nope.
Not quite yet.
But we wish you well. Okay, unless there's another comment for the order by board members or you, Dr. Gonzalez, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. So I'll give us 1 minute or 5 seconds here to tell any last minute comments. Being none, board members, thank you for your time today. All staff, thank you for your time. Go with the song in your heart. And with that, we will convene next week for another work session and regular meeting. Thank you for your time this evening. Good night.